few nights ago, the Rockets eliminated the Warriors from the NBA play-in tournament. What really stood out to me about this game was just how the refs really allowed these teams to play old school NBA defense. What defense used to be from, I would say, the mid 90s up until the mid 2000s. I always refer to the 1994 till up until the fall of 2005, the defensive era of the NBA. That era statistically is when the NBA was at its peak defensively. It it was like defenses playing at their maximum abilities. It's an unpopular era when you get past, I would say, 98 when Jordan retires. Then it becomes very unpopular among NBA fans. I would say, well, some who disliked offense. If you're an NBA fan that loved a great offense and just like to see like scores of like 150 to 120, that era definitely was not for you. But I enjoyed that era even after Jordan retired. I actually enjoyed it more because just the defensive intensity even kept on getting tougher and tougher every year that went by. However, scoring was very limited. Just you had it was very difficult because the way they had set up the defenses to be able to hand check defenders on the perimeter and just go at them relentlessly. One of the other factors of it back then too was you had no defensive 3-second violation, so guys could camp in the paint as much as they wanted to. So back then, if you wanted to score buckets, you had to be very creative, knowing that you're going to get hacked on the perimeter, people are going to hand check you. It was very hard to get your shot off. And most of the time, threes were able to be contested much easier back then because if you can hand check someone, put your hand on their hip and just start hacking away, and they're not going to call it touch fouls, it was very hard. You couldn't do the easy step back threes or the crossovers or any of that stuff. I know I'm going to this rant, but I'm just taking it back to Stephen Curry because I've always argued Stephen Curry in that era would have not been as great as he is today. I'm not going to say Steph Curry would have been a scrub or a bum or just a trashy player. I wouldn't say that. That to me is outrageous. I think one of the proof is that Steph Curry's father, Del Curry, I grew up watching him in North Carolina. I got to see a lot of Charlotte Hornet games growing up, and I saw Del play, and Del was a very good player. Not a great player, but above average role player. And he was amazing off the bench, one of the best six men in the NBA during the era. He won Sixth Man of the Year once. He was a very explosive scorer. Believe it or not, he only played one season once where he was averaging 30 minutes or more. For all of his career, he played less than 30 minutes per game, and he was able to score a ton off the bench. He was an explosive scorer. I would say he was more athletic than Stephen Curry. He was a little bit taller, so he could jump a little bit higher. He was more athletic. That's for sure what I remember of him. He had a quick release from three, just like Stephen Curry. He was able to do that. Now, here's where Stephen Curry is better than his father. Stephen Curry has better ball handling skills than Dell. Dell could never really take a guy off the dribble. He needed screens to be set on him at all times. And Stephen Curry could score without screens being set on him because he had the ball handling. However, I feel this era favored Stephen Curry in the sense that, sure, his ball handling was good, but if we're being honest, half the stuff he does in this current era would have been called for traveling back then. And that's not a knock against Stephen Curry. I would say that about all these perimeter players who are great scorers today. Half the stuff they do with this ball handling would have been called travels back then. I've seen footage of Kevin Durant traveling a lot and not being called for it. Harden, and the list just goes on. Most of the perimeter stars of this era have gone away with traveling. You could throw LeBron in there too. He's gone away with a lot. It's worse than it was in previous eras. Stephen Curry benefited from it. He benefited from not having to worry about getting hand checked, just like his dad had to get hand checked a bunch of times. It's much harder to hit a contested three when guys are riding you on the hip. Like I said, in that game against the Rockets, he had a good game. I would say not a great game. He shot 8 of 17 from the field, 19 points. That's a good game for a regular player. But the 3-point shooting is when it really shows. He shot 3 for 9 from the field. And that shows what happens when guys are allowed to hack at him with impunity. It's much harder for him to create a shot off the dribble. He had a very hard time doing that in the fourth quarter, where he shot, I believe, like 1 for 4 from 3-point range. And that's because guys were able to hand check him. He couldn't do his special crossover moves to free himself up to create the shot because he really needs a crossover moves to do that. Just Steph Curry cannot free himself to get a good 3-point shot without doing all that ball handling stuff, which I call traveling, which is illegal. And he needs screens from Draymond. Draymond sets him free with the illegal screens he's allowed to commit. Those are the two biggest reasons why Stephen Curry was able to become an explosive scorer. The rules favored him, that guys couldn't touch him on the perimeter, and the NBA changed the rules when it came to traveling. So they allowed a lot of guys to do this dancing stuff on the court, which allowed them to get easy open shots on the perimeter that normally they wouldn't. So there's no resistance to guys on the perimeter, and that allowed him to have an explosive peak when he was winning those MVPs and he was being dominant. But I feel under the old rules, Stephen Curry would have been more like Ray Allen. That's what I think. I think he would be better than his father because still he had better ball handling skills, even though he's getting away with traveling, than his dad did. And he was a better passer. So I think those skills would have enabled him to be still a very good player. But I don't think he would have been an MVP caliber player. I think he would have been a Ray Allen type of player, a guy who's a perennial all-star, still, I would say Hall of Famer, but not great, where you're just like, oh shit, this guy can carry a team to a championship being the guy. I just wouldn't see that. I think he would have had the same career trajectory as Ray Allen, where he would have been a good guy on a championship team, not being the number one guy, but the number two or the number three guy, like how Ray was the number three guy on that Celtics championship team. I think that's who he would have been had he had to play underneath the old NBA rules before they changed the rules. Essentially after 2005, the way they changed the rules was that every year after 2005, they started enforcing, I would say, fouls on the perimeter against perimeter defenses. They started calling more and more touch fouls. It was incremental after 2005, but year by year, it would get more and more restricted how much defense you could play. They would start enforcing it. And by the time around, I would say, 2015, when the Warriors won their championship, that's when the rules were completely deregulated to favor just perimeter players, and Stephen Curry took full advantage of it. That's when he became an MVP player. That's when he became dominant. That's when he became really unstoppable. That's when he had these ridiculous stretches. So I definitely believe he benefited a lot from these rule changes, probably more so than any NBA player in history when it comes to these rules. You could say LeBron, Durant, those guys also benefited more so from those rules too, that it favored perimeter players. But I think out of all the perimeter players of that era, Stephen Curry has benefited big time. If he had to play with current NBA rules, I don't think he would have ever won a title with the Warriors. I think it would have been very, very hard to overcome those defenses simply because guys would be allowed to hack, hand check, reach a lot. And back then, the way they call fouls was that it was pretty much no blood, no foul, that you had to take hard bumps and it had to be very obvious, a little touch, a little tap on the wrist or a hand. They were not going to call the foul like 80 to 90% of the time. And so Steph wouldn't have gotten that favorable treatment. And then you got to look at just in the paint, because then you didn't have the defensive 3-second violation. Let's just forget about them committing hard fouls on him. Just the fact that a guy could stay in the paint and just wait for Stephen Curry to enter the paint, there would have been resistance right there so he doesn't get easy layups. That alone would have contained him a lot. And then you got to factor in the hard fouls that was committed regularly back in the day when you drove him in the paint. So all these things would have limited him from being this MVP dominant player. He's definitely a beneficiary of this era and just Adam Silver's marketing goals. Let's be real. Stephen Curry is more relatable to casual fans than a player like LeBron James or a tall, lanky, ugly cricket like Kevin Durant. I know I had to take that insult at Kevin, but still, just those guys physically are not relatable to the regular person. And that's how they were able to sell Stephen Curry, because even though Stephen Curry is tall for a normal person at 6'3", on TV, he looks like some kind of regular guy who would be like 5'8", 5'9", because the heights of the other NBA players dwarfs of how tall he would have been. It dwarfs his actual height. So people forget, and then they live through him, and that's how they were able to sell him, especially the kids, because he looks like he's 10 years old. So that also allowed the NBA to sell him. So he benefited from all that marketing that Silver wanted to do. And even Silver has mentioned this so many times in interviews, like, hey, if we went back to the old rules, we would have never had a player like Stephen Curry. That's exactly what he says. So Stephen Curry, to me, is the biggest beneficiary from these rule changes. I can't say I'm a fan of his. I hated what he's done for the game. He's made it less fun because he spawned a generation of copycats where now we're stuck with seeing this 3-point spamming because of him. It sucks. It's not fun. That's the way I feel about it. But I give him credit. He's a great player. But I just don't see him being a dominant player in the previous eras or ever contending for best player of the league. Like I said, he would have been Ray Allen. He would have had his moments of greatness, but not a guy that could dominate from start to finish of the regular season and into the playoffs. I don't think it would have been the case. So I just want to go on that rant, and that's pretty much all I had to say.